Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as strangers at our door. Sometimes the family we've been searching for finds us when we least expect it. Marcus Wellington thought his heart had grown too cold for surprises. The successful businessman had built walls around his Manhattan mansion as thick as the ones around his soul. But on one stormy October evening, two frightened little girls would shatter both. When he opened his door to their desperate knocking, he saw only what they wanted him to see, two lost children needing shelter. What he couldn't see was the photograph hidden in their backpack, or the secret that connected them to the family. He'd lost 20 years ago. What truth were these girls hiding that would force a man to face his deepest regrets? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The grandfather clock in Marcus Wellington's study struck 9, its deep resonance echoing through empty corridors that had once known laughter. He sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing quarterly reports that would have excited him 20 years ago, when success still held meaning. Now the numbers blurred together like everything else in his carefully controlled existence. Rain pelted against the tall windows of his Fifth Avenue mansion, each drop a tiny percussion in the symphony of his solitude. The storm had been building all afternoon, mirroring the restlessness he'd felt since waking. At 52, Marcus had perfected the art of predictable days: coffee at 7, market reports by 8, meetings until 6, dinner alone at 7:30, and bed by 10. The routine had become his armor against the chaos that memories could bring. He reached for his father's vintage Patek Philippe watch, a habit when the weight of silence grew too heavy. The timepiece had been Harold Wellington's most prized possession, passed down through 3 generations of Wellington men who had built their fortune in real estate and investment. Marcus remembered his father winding it every morning, the ritual as sacred as prayer. "Time is the only currency you can't earn back, son," Harold had said the day he'd given Marcus the watch. "Spend it on what matters." The irony wasn't lost on him now. He'd spent the last 2 decades accumulating wealth and avoiding anything that mattered. The watch still kept perfect time, but the man wearing it had stopped living somewhere along the way. The mansion reflected his emotional state, magnificent but empty. 22 rooms furnished with museum-quality pieces, artwork that belonged in galleries, and a kitchen that rarely saw use beyond Maria's weekly visits to clean and stock the refrigerator. She was the only person who still entered his sanctuary, the 60-year-old Dominican woman who'd worked for the Wellingtons for 30 years. Even she couldn't bridge the chasm Marcus had built around himself. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant confirming tomorrow's meetings. 3 board positions, 2 charity galas he'd attend but not enjoy, and a real estate closing that would add another $1 million to accounts already bloated with money he'd never spend. Success had become a hollow victory, each achievement echoing. In the emptiness where his family once stood, the family tragedy 20 years ago had carved out his heart with surgical precision. His younger brother David, only 28, had died in a car accident after a bitter argument that was never resolved. Their last words had been angry ones, brothers divided by jealousy and pride. Marcus had inherited everything: the business, the properties, the responsibilities, but lost the only person who'd ever challenged him to be better. Their parents had died within 2 years of David's accident, as if grief had synchronized their departure. Marcus became the sole heir to a fortune that felt more like a curse. He'd thrown himself into work, expanding the family empire until Wellington Enterprises dominated Manhattan's luxury real estate market. Every building he developed was a monument to his isolation. The storm intensified, wind howling through the streets below like something alive and angry. Marcus poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon, a ritual that helped the evening hours pass. The amber liquid caught the lamplight, reminding him of David's eyes, warm and full of life in ways Marcus had never managed to be. His brother had been the dreamer, the one who spoke of family and legacy beyond money. David had wanted children. Someday, a house full of noise and love. He talked about teaching his kids to play piano, taking them camping, creating memories that would outlast any bank account. Marcus had dismissed those dreams as naive, choosing board meetings over family dinners, acquisitions over relationships. Now, he lived in the silence David would have filled. Lightning illuminated the mansion's facade, casting dramatic shadows. Across Persian rugs and Italian marble floors, the house had been their childhood home, where Wellington generations had grown up surrounded by privilege and expectation. But privilege meant nothing when you had no one to share it with, and expectation became a burden when you were the only one left to carry it. Marcus had kept David's room exactly as it was, though he never entered it. The door remained locked, preserving a shrine to regret that he couldn't bear to disturb or release. Sometimes he stood outside that door, hand on the knob, wondering if facing those memories might finally heal the wound that had never stopped bleeding. The intercom from the front gate crackled to life, startling him from his reverie. In 20 years, no one had arrived unannounced at this hour. He'd designed his life to avoid surprises, keeping the world at a distance through gates and security systems and carefully managed relationships that never went too deep. "Mr. Wellington," came the voice of his security guard, "there are 2 children at the gate. They appear to be alone and in distress." Marcus set down his bourbon, frowning at the inconvenience. Children, at this hour. Where are their parents? Unknown. "Sir, they're requesting shelter from the storm. They seem frightened." Through his window, Marcus could see the rain had become a deluge, the kind of October storm that turned streets into rivers and made even short distances treacherous. No child should be out in such weather, but involving himself in other people's problems violated every boundary he'd established. "Call the police," he said automatically. "They'll handle it." "Sir, they specifically asked for you. They know your name." That gave Marcus pause. Few children knew who he was, and those who did wouldn't seek him out. His reputation was that of a cold, successful businessman who attended charity events for tax purposes, but never actually engaged with causes or people. He was the kind of wealthy recluse that New York society respected, but didn't particularly like. Curiosity, an emotion he'd thought dead, flickered to life. He pressed the intercom button again. "What do they look like?" "Identical twins, sir." "Maybe. 8 or 9 years old. African American. They're soaked through and shivering." Something in the guard's description tugged at a memory Marcus couldn't quite place. He found himself walking to the window, trying to see through the storm to the figures at his gate. The security lights illuminated 2 small silhouettes huddled together, their unity in the face of the tempest stirring something unexpected in his chest. "Sir? What would you like me to do?" Marcus stood at the crossroads of his carefully ordered existence. Every instinct told him to maintain distance, to let authorities handle the situation while he returned to his bourbon and his reports. But another voice, one that sounded suspiciously like David's, whispered that some moments demanded more than self-protection. "Open the gate," he heard himself say. "Bring them to the house." The decision surprised him as much as it did the guard. Marcus Wellington didn't take in strays, didn't open his door to strangers, and certainly didn't disrupt his evening routine for anyone. But as he watched those 2 small figures brave the storm together, something shifted in the carefully constructed walls around his heart. He straightened his tie, smoothed his shirt, and prepared to do something he hadn't done in 20 years. Let strangers into his sanctuary. The bourbon sat forgotten on his desk as he walked toward the front door, his father's watch marking time toward a moment that would change everything. Outside, thunder rolled across Manhattan like a harbinger of transformation, and Marcus Wellington stood on the threshold of a future he couldn't yet imagine. The massive front door of the Wellington mansion opened with a gravity that seemed to acknowledge the weight of the moment. Marcus had expected to feel regret immediately, the familiar sting of a decision made from impulse rather than logic. Instead, he found himself studying two sets of dark eyes that held depths no child should possess. The twins stood in his marble foyer like mirror images of vulnerability, water dripping from their identical rain-soaked jackets onto floors that had never known such chaos. They couldn't have been more than 9 years old, their small hands clasped together with the fierce unity of survivors. Everything about them was identical, except for a tiny scar above the left girl's eyebrow, a detail that somehow made their perfect symmetry more poignant. "Thank you," the one with the scar whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm still raging outside. Her sister remained silent, dark eyes taking in every detail of the opulent entrance, with an intelligence that made Marcus uncomfortable. He'd never been good with children. David had been the one who could make kids laugh, who remembered their names and asked about their interests. Marcus had always maintained professional distance, even at the charity events where children were present. But these two demanded his attention in a way that felt both foreign and strangely familiar. "You're safe now," he said, the words feeling rusty in his mouth. "Let's get you out of those wet clothes." Maria appeared from the kitchen, as if summoned by maternal instinct, her weathered face immediately softening at the sight of the children. She'd raised 5 of her own, and seemed to possess an endless capacity for nurturing that Marcus had always envied and never understood. "Dios mío, look at these angels," she murmured, already moving toward them with towels from the hall closet. "Come, little ones, let's get you warm and dry." But the twins didn't move. They stood frozen in place, their hands still clasped, studying Marcus with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. It was as if they were searching for something in his face, some sign or recognition that he couldn't provide. "What are your names?" Marcus asked, crouching to their eye level in an instinctive attempt to seem less intimidating. The movement sent a sharp reminder through his knee, a souvenir from a college football injury that flared up in cold weather. The scarred twin looked at her sister before answering. "I'm Zoe," she said carefully. "This is Zara. We're sorry to bother you, but we didn't have anywhere else to go." Their speech patterns were too mature, their vocabulary too advanced for children their age. Marcus recognized the forced precociousness of kids who'd been required to grow up too fast. He'd seen it in mirrors during his own childhood, when family expectations had demanded adult reasoning from a boy's understanding. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently, though something in their posture already suggested the answer would be complicated. Zara finally spoke, her voice slightly deeper than her twins, but carrying the same careful control. "We don't have parents anymore. Not really." The simple statement carried undertones of loss that made Marcus's chest tighten unexpectedly. He recognized that particular kind of grief, the hollow acceptance that came after the worst had already happened. These children had learned to carry burdens that should have been shared by adults who weren't there anymore. Maria wrapped towels around both girls, her movements efficient but tender. "Come to the kitchen," she said softly. "I'll make hot chocolate while your clothes dry." As they moved through the mansion, Marcus noticed how the twins stayed together, never more than arm's length apart. They moved with synchronized steps, as if they'd developed their own gravity that kept them orbiting each other. It spoke to a bond deeper than simple sibling connection, the unity of two people who'd learned they could only count on each other. The kitchen, normally Maria's domain, felt different with children in it. The girls sat at the breakfast bar, still wrapped in towels, watching Maria prepare hot chocolate with the focused attention of students memorizing important information. Marcus leaned against the counter, studying them with growing curiosity and concern. "How did you know to come here?" he asked. "How do you know my name?" The twins exchanged another of their silent communications, entire conversations passing between them in glances and barely perceptible nods. Marcus had seen such wordless intimacy before, in couples married for decades, or soldiers who'd survived combat together. It was rare and precious, the kind of connection most people spent their lives searching for. "We've seen your picture," Zoe said finally, "in newspapers and things, But there was something else, something they weren't saying. Marcus had built his fortune-reading people, understanding the spaces between words where truth often lived. These girls were protecting a secret, carrying information they weren't ready to share. As Maria served the hot chocolate, Marcus noticed Zara absently rubbing her wrist where a faded hospital bracelet pecked out from beneath her towel sleeve. The plastic band was worn and discolored, the kind given to patients for identification. But why would a 9-year-old still be wearing one unless— "Have you been in the hospital recently?" he asked, nodding toward her wrist. Zara's hand immediately moved to cover the bracelet, but not before Marcus glimpsed what looked like typed information on the band. Her defensive reaction told him the bracelet wasn't just medical identification, it was a clue to their story. "We're fine now," Zara said quickly, but her sister shot her a warning look that suggested they'd discussed what information was safe to share. Maria set mugs of hot chocolate in front of them, garnished with marshmallows that immediately began melting into white clouds on the dark surface. The girls thanked her politely but didn't drink, still too alert and wary to relax completely. "Where have you been staying?" Marcus pressed gently, his instincts as a businessman kicking in. Information was currency, and these children were clearly holding valuable secrets. But unlike a corporate negotiation, he found himself genuinely concerned about their well-being rather than just wanting to solve the puzzle they represented. "Different places," Zoe said vaguely. "We move around a lot." The admission painted a picture Marcus didn't like. 2 young children with no stable home, carrying hospital bracelets and adult secrets. His protective instincts, long dormant, began stirring to life. These weren't just random children seeking shelter. They were refugees from some situation complicated enough to make them wary of questions and grateful for the kindness of strangers. "Are you running from someone?" he asked, the question more direct than he'd intended. Both girls went very still, their dark eyes widening with fear that confirmed his suspicion. They were indeed running, and whoever they were avoiding was significant enough to make them brave. A storm rather than stay wherever they'd been. "We're not in trouble," Zara said quickly. "We just needed somewhere safe for tonight." But safe from what? And why had they chosen his house specifically? Marcus's mind raced through possibilities. None of them good. Child trafficking, abuse, neglect, all scenarios that made his stomach turn and his resolve strengthen. The storm outside began to quiet, rain gentling from deluge to steady drumming against windows. The girls seemed to relax slightly as the thunder moved farther away, but their hands remained clasped on the counter between their untouched mugs. "You can stay tonight," Marcus said, surprising himself with the decision. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." Relief flooded their faces, so profound it was almost painful to witness. How long had they been searching for someone willing to help? How many doors had been closed before they'd found his? "Thank you," they whispered in unison, and for the first time since their arrival, Marcus saw them as children rather than mysterious visitors. They were exhausted, frightened kids who needed adults to make the world safe enough for them to simply exist. As Maria prepared guest rooms upstairs, Marcus found himself studying the hospital bracelet still visible on Zara's wrist. Whatever information it contained might be the key to understanding their situation, but pushing too hard too soon would only make them withdraw further. For now, providing shelter was enough. Tomorrow, he would begin unraveling the mystery of why 2 children had appeared at his gate, why they seemed to know him, and what truth they were protecting that had driven them into the storm. He had no way of knowing that their secret would force him to confront the 20-year-old wound he'd never allowed to heal, or that these strangers would become the family he'd thought was lost forever. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Wellington mansion, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden rays. Marcus had barely slept, spending most of the night questioning his decision to take in 2 strangers. His carefully ordered world felt off balance, like a painting hung slightly askew that demanded constant attention. he found the twins in the breakfast room, dressed in clothes Maria had somehow procured, simple jeans and sweaters that actually fit them properly. They sat at the antique dining table with perfect posture, hands folded, waiting with the patience of children accustomed to uncertainty. Their identical faces turned toward him as he entered, hope and wariness battling in their dark eyes. "Good morning," Marcus said, his voice stiff with unfamiliarity. He'd never begun a day with children present, never had to consider anyone else's needs before his coffee and market reports. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington," they replied in unison, the formality both charming and heartbreaking. These were children who'd learned to earn their welcome through politeness and minimal inconvenience. Maria appeared from the kitchen, carrying plates of eggs Benedict, fresh fruit, and whole-grain toast cut into perfect triangles. She'd been here since dawn, he realized, preparing a breakfast elaborate enough for a luxury hotel. Her dark eyes sparkled with the joy of having children to spoil, a maternal energy he hadn't seen since her own grandchildren had last visited. "Years ago, eat," she commanded gently, setting plates before the twins with the authority of someone accustomed to feeding reluctant children. Growing girls need proper nutrition. Marcus took his usual seat at the head of the table, a position that had felt natural when he dined alone, but now seemed too distant, too formal for the intimacy of a shared meal. He watched the girls eat with careful precision, using their utensils properly and chewing quietly, habits that spoke to strict upbringing or adaptive survival skills. "Do you like art?" he found himself asking, noticing how Zoe arranged her fruit into colorful patterns before eating it, and how Zara had unconsciously traced designs in the condensation on her orange juice glass. Both girls nodded eagerly, their reserve cracking slightly at the mention of something they clearly loved. "We draw," Zara said softly, "and paint sometimes, when we have supplies." An idea formed in Marcus's mind, driven by a sudden desire to see them smile. "Would you like to see my father's art room? It hasn't been used in years, but all the supplies are still there." The transformation was immediate. Their identical faces lit up with genuine excitement, the first unguarded emotion he'd seen from them. "Really?" Zoe whispered, as if afraid the offer might evaporate. After breakfast, Marcus led them through corridors lined with family portraits and expensive artwork to a room he hadn't entered in decades. His father had been a weekend painter, creating landscapes and still lifes with the dedication of someone who understood that creativity fed parts of the soul that business couldn't reach. The art room had been Harold Wellington's sanctuary, a place where spreadsheets gave way to watercolors and quarterly reports yielded to the simple joy of creation. The room was exactly as he'd left it. Easels draped in cloth, paints organized by color, brushes of every size standing at attention in ceramic holders. Afternoon light streamed through north-facing windows designed to provide perfect illumination for serious work. "Oh," Zara breathed, her voice filled with wonder as she took in the setup that represented every young artist's dream. "It's beautiful," Zoe added, already moving toward a set of colored pencils with the magnetic pull of a musician drawn to a piano. Marcus pulled the dust covers off the easels and opened windows to let fresh air chase away the mustiness of disuse. "You're welcome to use anything you'd like," he said, then hesitated. "I'll be in my study if you need anything." But as he started to leave, Zoe caught his sleeve gently. "Would you stay?" she asked. "Just for a little while?" The request surprised him. Children typically wanted adult supervision only when they were required to have it, not when they'd been given permission to play freely. But something in her voice suggested this wasn't about supervision. It was about connection, the desire to share joy with someone who might understand its value. Marcus pulled up a chair near the windows and settled in to watch, expecting to be bored by childish scribbles. Instead, he found himself witnessing something remarkable. The twins didn't just draw, they created with the focused intensity of serious artists. Their hands moved across paper with confident strokes, bringing images to life with skill that seemed far beyond their years. Zoe worked on a landscape that captured the view from the mansion's gardens with impressive perspective and detail. She included elements Marcus recognized: the old oak tree where David had built a treehouse, the stone bench where their mother used to read. Details she couldn't have known unless she'd studied the grounds carefully during her brief time here. Zara's artwork was different but equally sophisticated. She drew people, portraits of faces that seemed to tell stories. Marcus watched her sketch Maria's hands kneading bread, capturing not just the physical appearance, but somehow the essence of nurturing, a care those hands represented. "You're both very talented," he said, meaning it genuinely. "Have you had lessons?" They exchanged one of their silent communications before Zoe answered. "Our mom taught us. She said art was how the heart speaks when words aren't enough." Past tense. Their mother had taught them but no longer could. Marcus felt another piece of their story settling into place, a picture of loss that helped explain their unusual maturity and deep bond. "She sounds like a wise woman," he said carefully. "She was," Zara replied, her voice carrying quiet sadness. "She said we had a gift that should be shared with the world someday." As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself drawn into their creative process. He began pointing out art supplies they might not have noticed, sharing stories about his father's painting techniques, even attempting a simple sketch of his own, something he hadn't done since childhood art classes. The twins were generous teachers, offering encouragement and gentle suggestions that made his clumsy efforts slightly less embarrassing. Their laughter filled the room with a sound the mansion hadn't heard in 20 years, and Marcus discovered muscles in his face that had forgotten how to form genuine smiles. It was Zara who noticed the piece of paper that had fallen from her backpack when she'd pulled out her worn eraser. She quickly moved to retrieve it, but not before Marcus glimpsed what appeared to be a hand-drawn family tree with carefully written names connected by lines and hearts. "What's that?" he asked curiously, but Zara had already crumpled the paper and stuffed it into her pocket, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Nothing important," she said quickly, but her sister shot her a look that suggested otherwise. Marcus didn't press, though his curiosity was thoroughly aroused. A family tree drawn by children usually included parents, grandparents, siblings, the people who mattered in their young lives. The fact that Zara was hiding it suggested the names on that paper were significant in ways she wasn't ready to explain. Maria appeared in the doorway with lunch on a tray, her face beaming at the sight of the transformed room and the happy children within it. "Look at these artists," she announced proudly, already making this old house feel alive again. As they ate sandwiches surrounded by drying artwork, Marcus realized something had shifted during the morning. The twins seemed more relaxed, more willing to share small details about their lives. They talked about favorite colors and dream projects, revealed that they sang as well as they drew, and admitted they'd always wanted to learn piano. "There's a piano in the music room," Marcus said without thinking. "It hasn't been played in years, but it should still be in tune." The excitement in their eyes was worth more than any business deal he'd ever closed. For the first time since David's death, the mansion felt less like a mausoleum and more like a home. These two small strangers were working magic he hadn't thought possible, breathing life back into spaces that had been dormant too long. But even as warmth began melting the ice around his heart, Marcus couldn't forget the hidden family tree, or the hospital bracelet still adorning Zara's wrist. These children had secrets, and his growing affection for them was becoming tangled with questions that would soon demand answers. The sound of piano music drifted through the Wellington mansion, like a ghost returning to familiar halls. Marcus paused outside his study, listening to the tentative melody emerging from the music room. It was Chopin's Minute Waltz, simplified and halting, but recognizable. The same piece David had struggled with during childhood lessons before, abandoning piano for what he'd called more interesting pursuits. Curiosity drew Marcus down the hall to where he found the twins seated side by side on the piano bench. Zoe's fingers picking out the melody, while Zara provided a basic bass line. They played by ear, he realized, adapting the complex piece to match their skill level with an intuitive understanding of music that couldn't be taught. "You said you wanted to learn piano," Marcus observed from the doorway, "but it sounds like you already know quite a bit." The girls stopped playing, their hands dropping to their laps with the guilty reaction of children caught doing something they feared might be forbidden. "We didn't hurt anything," Zara said quickly. "We were very careful." Their assumption that he might be angry revealed too much about their past experiences with adult authority. Marcus stepped into the room, approaching the piano that had sat silent for 2 decades, its polished surface reflecting afternoon light from tall windows. "I'm not upset," he said gently, taking a seat in the nearby wingback chair his father had occupied during family music lessons. "Where did you learn to play?" "Mom taught us," Zoe replied, her fingers unconsciously finding keys and pressing them silently. She said music was another language for feelings. Their mother again, each mention painted the picture of a woman who'd valued creativity and emotional expression, qualities that had clearly shaped her daughters, despite whatever circumstances had ultimately separated them. Marcus found himself increasingly curious about this woman who'd left such a profound impact on 2 remarkable children. "What was her name?" he asked softly. The twins exchanged their wordless communication before Zara answered. Sarah, Michelle." She pronounced the names with reverence, the way children spoke of saints or fairy tale princesses, figures both beloved and lost. Sarah Michelle. The name stirred something in Marcus's memory, a half-formed recognition that danced at the edges of his consciousness like a word on the tip of his tongue. Had David ever mentioned someone named Sarah? The years immediately before his death remained painful territory that Marcus had worked hard to avoid revisiting. "She sounds like a wonderful mother," Marcus said, meaning it sincerely. She was. Both girls whispered together, their shared grief so palpable it made the room feel heavier. After they'd returned to their drawing in the art room, Marcus retreated to his study with his laptop and a growing sense of urgency. If these children were truly alone in the world, if they were running from dangerous circumstances, then he needed to understand their situation completely before making any long-term decisions about their care. He began with basic internet searches. Sarah Michelle, New York, Sarah Michelle twins, Sarah Michelle obituary. The common name returned thousands of results, none immediately relevant, but then he refined his search parameters, adding Wellington to the mix on a hunch he couldn't quite explain. The 7th page of results contained a link that made his blood run cold. It was a death notice from 8 months ago, sparse but devastating in its simplicity. Sarah Michelle Wellington Brooks, 34, beloved mother of twins Zoe and Zara, passed peacefully after a courageous battle with cancer. Services private. Memorial. Donations may be made to the Children's Art Foundation, Wellington Brooks. The hyphenated name hit Marcus like a physical blow, pieces of a puzzle suddenly clicking into place with terrible clarity. Sarah Michelle Wellington. David's Sarah. His brother had been secretly married to a woman named Sarah, and these children, these beautiful, talented, mysterious children, were David's daughters. With shaking hands, Marcus continued his search, finding more details that painted a devastating picture. Sarah had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 18 months ago. She'd fought bravely while caring for 9-year-old twins, exhausting her savings on medical bills before ultimately losing the battle that had consumed the final years of her short life. The girls had been placed in foster care after her death, but the records suggested multiple placements that hadn't worked out. The most recent had been with a family in Queens, but something had gone wrong there too, badly enough to make 2 children brave the streets rather than stay. Marcus stared at the computer screen, his world tilting as 20 years of assumptions. crumbled around him. David hadn't died alone and unloved. He'd had a secret family, a wife and children he'd kept hidden for reasons Marcus could only guess at. The argument that had driven them apart, had it been about Sarah? Had David been trying to introduce his girlfriend to family who might not approve? The weight of lost years pressed down on Marcus's shoulders like a physical burden. While he'd been building his empire of isolation, his brother's daughters had been growing up in a world that included art and music and a mother who'd taught them to see beauty in everyday moments. They'd had the childhood David would have wanted, full of creativity and love, until cancer had stolen it all away. He thought about the hidden family tree Zara had clutched so protectively, the way both girls had studied his face with such intensity when they'd first arrived. They'd known who he was, not from newspapers, but from their mother's stories. Sarah had told them about their father's family, about the uncle who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten how to let anyone in. A soft knock at his study door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. He looked up to find both twins standing uncertainly in the doorway, their artwork clutched in small hands. "We made something for you," Zoe said shyly, stepping forward to place a drawing on his desk. It was a portrait of Marcus himself, sitting in the art room that morning, watching them work with an expression of gentle interest they'd captured perfectly. But it was more than just a physical likeness. They'd somehow drawn the man he'd forgotten he could be, someone capable of patience and wonder and genuine care for others. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Thank you." But as they turned to leave, he noticed something that made his heart stop. Sticking out of Zara's back pocket was the corner of a document, official-looking paper with an embossed seal visible. When she shifted her weight, more of it became visible, and Marcus caught sight of what looked like the header of a birth certificate. "Zara," he called gently, "what's that paper in your pocket?" She froze, her hand moving protectively to cover the document. "It's nothing," she said quickly, but her sister was already shaking her head with the exasperation of someone tired of keeping secrets. "She keeps all our important papers," Zoe explained, ignoring Zara's sharp look. "Mom said they were precious, that we should never lose them because they proved who we were." "May I see?" Marcus asked, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. After a long moment of internal struggle, Zara slowly withdrew a folded copy of what was indeed a birth certificate. With trembling fingers, Marcus unfolded the document and read the names that confirmed what he'd already begun to suspect. Father, David Michael Wellington. Mother, Sarah Michelle Brooks. Children, Zoe, Sarah Wellington, Zara, Michelle Wellington. The room seemed to spin around Marcus as he stared at proof of the family he'd never known existed. These weren't just two lost children who'd found their way to his door. They were his nieces, his brother's daughters, the living continuation of a Wellington legacy he'd thought had died with David. "You knew," he whispered, looking up at their young faces with wonder and heartbreak. "You've known all along who I was." Both girls nodded solemnly, their secret finally revealed. "Mum told us stories about our daddy," Zoe said quietly, "and about his brother Marcus, who lived in a big house but was very sad and lonely. Sarah had known about him, had kept David's memory alive for their daughters while Marcus had spent 20 years trying to forget. She'd taught them about family they'd never met, preparing them for a reunion she couldn't have known would come under such circumstances. As Marcus looked at his brother's children, his family, he realized that his carefully ordered world hadn't been disrupted by strangers after all. It had been reclaimed by the very people who belonged there. Two little girls who carried David's legacy in their eyes and Sarah's wisdom in their hearts. The question was no longer who they were, but whether he could become the uncle they deserved, the man David would have wanted them to know. The revelation that Zoe and Zara were his nieces left Marcus feeling as though he'd been struck by lightning, stunned, disoriented, and fundamentally changed. He sat alone in his study that evening after the girls had gone to bed, staring at the birth certificate that had rewritten his understanding of the past 20 years. David hadn't died alone. He'd had love, family, a future that extended beyond. The grave through two remarkable daughters who now sat under Marcus's roof, the weight of regret pressed down on him like a physical force. How many birthdays had he missed? How many Christmases had passed without him knowing these children existed? How many times had Sarah struggled to explain to curious daughters why their father's family remained absent from their lives, unable to sit still any longer? Marcus found himself walking through the mansion's corridors, past family portraits that now held different meaning. The Wellingtons had always been a small family, their bloodline precious because it was fragile. Learning that it had continued, had flourished in secret while he'd mourned its ending, felt like discovering he'd been living in a carefully constructed lie. He stopped outside David's bedroom, his hand resting on the doorknob he hadn't turned. In 20 years, the lock had long since been removed, but emotional barriers had kept the room sealed more effectively than any key. Tonight, with his nieces sleeping down the hall, those barriers felt less insurmountable. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a space preserved exactly as David had left it. Marcus had instructed Maria to clean, but never to change anything, creating a shrine to grief that had outlived its purpose. Now, moonlight streaming through familiar windows illuminated a room that felt less like a tomb and more like a time capsule waiting to reveal its secrets. David's desk still held the organized chaos of a creative mind, notebooks filled with architectural sketches, travel brochures for places he'd wanted to visit, and a small wooden box Marcus had given him for his 21st birthday. The box had been empty then, meant to hold treasures yet to be discovered. Marcus approached it now with trembling hands, wondering what secrets his brother had deemed worth preserving. The hinges protested softly as the box opened, revealing a collection that made Marcus's breath catch. Love letters. Dozens of them, written in feminine handwriting on paper that still held traces of perfume after all these years. The return address confirmed what his heart already knew. Sarah Michelle Brooks, written in the careful script of someone who understood that words mattered. With reverent fingers, Marcus selected a letter dated just 3 months before David's. Your death. The envelope bore signs of frequent handling, as though David had read and reread its contents countless times. My dearest David, it began, and Marcus felt like an intruder glimpsing into his brother's most private world. But the need to understand, to piece together the life he'd never known about, compelled him to continue. The doctor confirmed it today. We're having twins. I'm still in shock, holding the ultrasound pictures and seeing 2 perfect little beings, who will grow up to have your eyes and hopefully your gentle heart. I wanted to call you immediately, but I know you're in that difficult space with your family again, trying to find the right time to tell them about us. I understand your hesitation, truly I do. Marcus sounds like a formidable man, and I know how much his approval means to you. But David, my love, we can't keep hiding forever. These babies will need their family, all of it. They'll want to know about their grandfather's watch and their grandmother's recipes and the uncle who builds beautiful buildings that touch the sky. Please don't let fear keep you from the love that's waiting. Sometimes the people who seem the most difficult to reach are simply the ones who've forgotten how to be reached. Marcus's hands shook as he lowered the letter, Sarah's words cutting through him with surgical precision. She'd understood the dynamic between the brothers better than they'd understood themselves. David had been afraid of Marcus's judgment, afraid of introducing his pregnant girlfriend to a family that valued tradition and propriety above all else. But what if Marcus had surprised them both? What if the coldness David feared had been a defense mechanism rather than true indifference? The questions multiplied like wounds, each one deeper than the last. He selected another letter, this one dated 6 months later. The girls were born. Yesterday morning, Zoe at 6:47 a.m. and Zara 3 minutes later. They're perfect, David, absolutely perfect. Zoe has your stubborn chin, and Zara got your grandfather's hands. Long fingers that will someday create beautiful things just like you do. I keep waiting for you to walk through that hospital door, but I know things are complicated right now. The fight with Marcus has hurt you more than you'll admit, and I won't pressure you to choose between your family and ours. But please know that whatever happens, these girls will know who their father is. They'll know about the man who draws buildings like poetry and believes architecture should inspire rather than just shelter. Time will soften the edges of whatever drove you and your brother apart. People who love each other always find their way back, even if it takes longer than we'd like. Tears Marcus hadn't shed in decades blurred the pages as he continued reading through a correspondence that revealed the depth of his brother's happiness and the complexity of his pain. Sarah's letters painted David as a devoted father-to-be, torn between love for his new family and loyalty to his old one. She never pressured him to choose sides, never demanded he prioritize her over Marcus. Instead, she consistently encouraged reconciliation, believing that love could overcome whatever pride and misunderstanding had divided the brothers. The final letter was dated just 1 week before David's death, its contents devastating in their prophetic quality. I keep having dreams where you and Marcus are old men, sitting on our front porch, watching the girls play in the garden. In the dreams, you're both laughing about whatever foolish thing came between you, wondering why it took so long to remember that family is more important than being right. Promise me something, my love. If anything ever happens to you, promise you'll find a way to let Marcus know about us, not because we need him, but because he needs us. Lonely people don't choose isolation because they prefer it. They choose it because they've forgotten they have other options. The girls and I are your legacy, David. We're proof that the Wellington family will continue, that all the love your parents poured into you wasn't wasted. Don't let that legacy stay hidden behind pride or fear. Marcus set the letter down with shaking hands, overwhelmed by Sarah's wisdom and generosity of spirit. Even while carrying the full burden of raising twins alone after David's death, she'd thought about the brother-in-law who didn't know they existed. She'd understood what he was only now beginning to grasp, that his isolation hadn't been chosen from strength, but had grown from wounds he'd never allowed to heal. A soft sound in the hallway made him look up to find both twins standing in the doorway, their identical expressions troubled with the intuitive concern children had for the adults they'd learned to love. "You're sad," Zoe observed with the directness that only children could manage. "We heard you crying," Zara added softly, stepping into the room that had been forbidden territory since their arrival. Marcus quickly wiped his face, trying to compose himself, but the girls were already moving toward him with the determination of small people on a mission of comfort. They'd changed into pajamas Maria had found for them, simple cotton sets that made them look even younger and more vulnerable. "We don't like it when people are sad because of us," Zoe said, climbing onto the chair beside David's desk without asking permission. "You're not making me sad," Marcus assured them, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sad because I missed so much. I didn't know about you, about your mother, about how much your father loved you all." Zara joined her sister, both girls now perched like small birds, offering comfort to a wounded giant. "Mom said Daddy talked about you all the time," she said quietly. "She said you were important to him, but that grown-ups sometimes hurt each other's feelings and forget how to say sorry." The simple wisdom of Sarah's teachings filtered through her daughter's understanding, cut straight to the heart of 20 years of stubborn pride and regret. Marcus had spent 2 decades believing David had died angry with him, never knowing that his brother had carried love alongside the hurt, never realizing that forgiveness had been waiting if he'd simply been brave enough to reach for it. "Would you like to see pictures of your father?" Marcus asked, gesturing toward albums he'd never opened since David's death. Both girls nodded eagerly, and for the next hour, Marcus found himself sharing memories he'd thought were too painful to revisit. He showed them David, as a young boy, building impossible structures with blocks, as a teenager dreaming of architectural marvels, as a young man whose smile could light up any room. With each story, with each photograph, Marcus felt the ice around his heart continuing to thaw. These weren't just his brother's daughters, they were his family, his responsibility, his second chance at getting love right. Sarah had been correct in her final letter. They were David's legacy, proof that the Wellington name would continue. Through two remarkable girls who carried their father's creativity and their mother's wisdom. But even as love began taking root in places that had been barren for 20 years, Marcus knew their story was far from over. The girls were still legally in the system, still vulnerable to being taken away. If he wanted to keep them, to honor both David's memory and Sarah's faith in family, he would have to fight for the right to be their guardian. It was a battle he was finally ready to wage. The morning after discovering Sarah's letters, Marcus woke with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in 20 years. Sunlight streamed through his bedroom windows, but instead of the usual dread that accompanied each new day, he felt the pull of responsibility and possibility. Two little girls were depending on him, and for the first time since David's death, someone needed him for reasons that had nothing to do with business or money. He found Zoe and Zara already awake, sitting at the kitchen island with Maria, who was teaching them how to fold napkins into elaborate shapes. Their laughter filled the space with music that made the grand mansion feel more like a home than it had in decades. When they saw him, their faces lit up with genuine pleasure. Not the polite gratitude of temporary guests, but the warm welcome of family. "Uncle Marcus," Zoe called out, the title rolling off her tongue as naturally as if she'd been using it all her life. The word hit him with unexpected force. Uncle. He was someone's uncle, someone who would be remembered in bedtime prayers and birthday wishes and scraped-knee comfort sessions. The role came with weight and privilege in equal measure, a chance to matter in ways that had nothing to do with quarterly profits or real estate acquisitions. "Good morning," he said, his voice softer than usual. "What are you learning today?" "Maria is teaching us about family traditions," Zara explained, holding up a perfectly folded napkin swan. "She says every family has special ways of doing things that get passed down like treasures." Marcus felt a pang of loss, thinking about all the Wellington family traditions these girls had missed. Christmas morning rituals, birthday customs, the stories that connected generations. But perhaps it wasn't too late to begin creating new traditions, building bridges between the past they'd never known and the future they could still share. After breakfast, while the girls worked on art projects, Marcus returned to his study with a heavy heart and a necessary task. If he was going to fight for custody of his nieces, he needed to understand exactly what they'd been through since Sarah's death. The legal documentation would tell one story, but he suspected the real truth would be more complicated and more heartbreaking. His private investigator, a discreet man named Thompson, who specialized in sensitive family matters, had already begun compiling a comprehensive report. The information arrived via encrypted email, each page revealing another layer of tragedy and system failure that had brought two innocent children to his doorstep in desperation. Sarah Michelle Wellington Brooks had died 8 months ago at Presbyterian Hospital, with her daughters at her bedside. The death certificate confirmed what Marcus had already learned: pancreatic cancer, stage 4, a diagnosis that had given her maybe 6 months but had stretched to nearly 2 years through sheer maternal determination. She'd fought longer than doctors thought possible, driven by the need to prepare her daughters for a world without her. The girls had been placed with their first foster family immediately after Sarah's funeral. The Hendersons had seemed suitable on paper, middle-aged couple with experience fostering children, adequate income, no red flags in their background. Checks, but within 2 months they'd requested the girls' removal, citing behavioral issues and difficulty adjusting. Marcus's jaw tightened as he read the caseworker's notes. The behavioral issues included excessive crying, nightmares, and clinging to each other, perfectly normal responses from children processing grief and trauma. The Hendersons had expected grateful, compliant orphans who would slip seamlessly into their household routine. Instead, they'd gotten two heartbroken little girls who needed patience and understanding more than rules and structure. The second placement had lasted 4 months. The Rodriguezes had tried harder, understanding that the twins needed time to heal. But their own teenage children had struggled with sharing parental attention, leading to household tension that ultimately resulted in another failed placement. The girls weren't the problem. They were simply children whose needs exceeded the emotional resources available in temporary homes. The third and most recent placement had been the most devastating. The Carters had specifically requested twins, claiming they wanted to complete their family with older children who could contribute to household responsibilities. The reality had been far different. Zoe and Zara were expected to care for younger foster children, handle cleaning duties, and essentially function as unpaid household help rather than beloved daughters. When Zara had developed a fever and needed medical attention, Mrs. Carter had been annoyed by the inconvenience rather than concerned for the child's welfare. When Zoe had protectively stood up for her sister, both girls had been punished for talking back and ungrateful attitudes. The final straw had come when Mr. Carter had lost his temper over a broken dish, screaming at the twins in language that left them terrified and convinced they had to escape. They'd run away 3 days ago, taking only their backpack of precious documents and memories. They'd spent 2 nights in a subway station before the storm had driven them to seek shelter. Somehow, through a combination of streetcar routes and child logic navigation, they'd found their way to the one place their mother had taught them to think of as home, the mansion where their father's family lived. Marcus closed the report with shaking hands, rage and heartbreak warring in his chest. While he'd been living in isolated comfort, his brother's daughters had been passed between strangers like unwanted packages. They'd experienced loss, disappointment, and fear that no child should ever know. They'd learned that adults couldn't always be trusted, that love came with conditions, and that safety was never guaranteed. But they'd also learned to protect each other, to carry hope through dark times, and to recognize family even when it came disguised as a reluctant stranger. At a mansion door, the memory of his last fight with David crashed over Marcus with fresh intensity. It had been about money, of course. It always was. David had wanted to start his own architectural firm, to break free from Wellington enterprises and build something uniquely his own. Marcus, ever the pragmatist, had seen it as reckless risk-taking that could jeopardize the family's financial stability. "You don't understand," David had said, his young face flushed with passion and frustration. "I don't want to spend my life making rich people richer. I want to build homes for families who need them, design spaces that bring communities together. Architecture should serve people, not profits." "Idealism doesn't pay bills," Marcus had replied coldly, playing the role of responsible older brother with ruthless efficiency. "You're 28 years old, David. It's time to grow up and accept reality." "Reality according to who? You?" David's voice had cracked with emotion. "Just because you've chosen to live like a monk in this museum doesn't mean the rest of us have to die of loneliness too." The words had been a direct hit, striking at Marcus's deepest insecurities about his isolated lifestyle and inability to form lasting relationships. His response had been swift and cutting, designed to wound as deeply as he'd been wounded. "At least I'm realistic about what I can achieve," he'd said. "At least I don't waste time chasing fairy tales about changing the world through pretty buildings." David had stared at him for a long moment, hurt and disappointment replacing anger in his dark eyes. "You know what, Marcus? Maybe you're right. Maybe some of us are meant to dream while others just count money. But someday, when you're sitting alone in this empty house, surrounded by all your precious reality, remember that you chose it. It had been their last conversation. David had died 3 weeks later in a car accident, driving home from what Marcus later learned was a job interview with a firm that specialized in affordable housing projects. He'd been pursuing his dreams despite his brother's disapproval, trying to build the kind of life he'd envisioned with Sarah and their unborn daughters. Now, 20 years later, Marcus finally understood what David had been trying to tell him. Success without connection was just another form of failure. Wealth without family was poverty of the worst kind. His brother had been trying to choose love over money, purpose over profit, and Marcus had mocked him for it. But perhaps it wasn't. Too late for redemption. David's daughters needed what Marcus had in abundance: security, resources, and a chance to grow up knowing they were valued for who they were rather than what they could provide. In caring for them, he could honor both Sarah's faith in family and David's belief in choosing love over convenience. A soft knock at his study door interrupted his brooding. Both girls stood uncertainly in the doorway, their faces showing the careful hope of children who'd learned that good things could disappear without warning. "Maria said you were working," Zoe said softly. "We didn't want to bother you, but we made you something." She held out a folded piece of paper, another artwork created during their morning session. Marcus accepted it with hands that trembled slightly, unfolding it to reveal a drawing that stopped his heart. It showed the three of them, Marcus in his study chair, Zoe and Zara on either side of him, all of them smiling. But it wasn't just their faces that had been captured with loving detail. The girls had drawn them as a constellation, with lines connecting their hearts like stars, forming a family pattern in the vast darkness of space. At the bottom, in careful, childish script they'd written, "For Uncle Marcus, who helped us find our way home." Looking at their hopeful faces, at the love they were offering despite every reason to guard their hearts, Marcus made the decision that would define the rest of his life. These children belonged here, not because the system had failed them, but because family was more than blood. It was choice, commitment, and the courage to love despite fear. "Would you like to stay here permanently?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Would you like me to be your guardian, officially and legally?" The twins looked at each other, conducting one of their silent conversations before breaking into smiles that could have powered the entire mansion. "Yes," they whispered together, and Marcus finally understood what David had been trying to teach him all those years ago, that some dreams were worth every risk, and love was always the most profitable investment of all. 3 days after Marcus had promised the twins they could stay permanently, reality arrived in the form of a stern-faced woman from Child Protective Services standing at his front door. Ms. Patricia Knowles carried herself with the rigid efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering bad news and weathering emotional storms. Her grey suit matched her expression, and the leather briefcase in her hand suggested this was not a social call. Marcus had been in the music room with the girls, listening to them play a duet they'd been practicing. Their laughter had filled spaces that had been silent too long, and for the first time in decades, he'd felt the warm contentment that came from being exactly where he belonged. Now, as he looked through the security monitor at his unexpected visitor, that contentment curdled into dread. "Mr. Wellington," Ms. Knowles said when he opened the door, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd had similar conversations too many times to count. "I'm here about Zoe and Zara Wellington. We need to discuss their situation immediately." The girls appeared in the foyer behind Marcus, their faces reflecting the wariness of children who'd learned that official visits rarely brought good news. They moved closer together, instinctively, their hands finding each other with the magnetic certainty of compass needles pointing north. "What situation?" Marcus asked, though his sinking heart already suspected the answer. Ms. Knowles glanced at the twins with the practiced compassion of a professional who cared, but couldn't afford to show it too openly. Perhaps we should speak privately first, she suggested. No, Zara said firmly, her young voice carrying surprising strength. We want to hear whatever you're going to say. We're tired of adults making decisions about us without us. Her twin nodded in support, both girls presenting a united front that would have been impressive if it weren't so heartbreaking. They'd learned too young that their voices might be the only thing protecting them in a world where children were often seen as problems to be solved rather than people to be cherished. Ms. Knowles hesitated, then opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Very well. Mr. Wellington, I'm afraid the girls can't remain here. They're wards of the state, with legal proceedings already in motion regarding their permanent placement. What kind of proceedings? Marcus demanded, though he was already reaching for his phone to call his lawyer. The Carters, their most recent foster family, have petitioned to adopt them. The initial hearing is scheduled for next week, and the judge has already indicated favorable inclination toward their request, given their previous fostering experience. The words hit Marcus like physical blows. The Carters, the same people who'd treated his nieces like unpaid servants, who'd screamed at them and made them so frightened they'd run away into a storm rather than endure another night under that roof. The Carters are why the girls ran away, Marcus said, his voice tight with controlled fury. They were being abused. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Knowles replied carefully. The official report indicates the girls left without permission after a minor disciplinary incident. There are no substantiated claims of abuse in their file. Because children are always believed when they speak up against adults, Zoe said, with bitter wisdom that made Marcus's heart ache. Because the system always listens to kids instead of just wanting to move us along to the next placement. Ms. Knowles's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the exhausted social worker beneath the official exterior. She'd heard similar stories too many times, seen too many children fail to thrive in homes that looked perfect on paper but lacked the emotional resources to truly nurture damaged young souls. Be that as it may, she said gently, the law requires proper procedures. Mr. Wellington, you've had these children in your home for less than a week without legal authority. While your intentions appear good, you're technically in violation of custody orders. They're my nieces, Marcus said, pulling out the birth certificate that had changed everything. David Wellington was my brother. These are his daughters. Ms. Knowles examined the document carefully, her expression shifting as she processed the implications. This changes things considerably, she admitted, but it doesn't automatically override existing legal proceedings. Blood relation gives. You standing to petition for custody, but it doesn't supersede current guardianship processes. She opened her folder and withdrew a set of legal documents that made Marcus's blood run cold. The Carters filed for formal adoption proceedings 3 weeks ago, citing their experience with the twins and their desire to provide stable family integration. Their petition is supported by testimonials from previous successful adoptions and a home study that meets all state requirements. Marcus scanned the documents, his businessman's eye immediately spotting the calculated language designed to present the Carters as ideal parents, while subtly characterizing the twins as challenging children requiring structured guidance. The papers painted a picture of grateful benefactors willing to take on difficult cases, while the girls themselves were reduced to problems requiring professional management. This is bureaucratic nonsense, Marcus said, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. These children have family. They have a blood relative who can provide for them. Why would the state prefer strangers over their own uncle? Because the system doesn't always work the way common sense suggests it should, Ms. Knowles replied with surprising honesty. The Carters initiated proceedings when the girls were officially classified as hard to place due to their age and the requirement that they stay together. Few people want older twins, especially ones carrying trauma from multiple failed placements. The clinical description of his nieces as hard to place filled Marcus with rage so pure it was almost cleansing. These weren't problem children. They were remarkable survivors who'd maintained their bond and their hope despite every reason to give up. They deserved homes where they were celebrated, not merely tolerated. "What happens now?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Ms. Knowles consulted her notes with the weary efficiency of someone delivering the same speech too often. "The girls will need to be placed in emergency foster care while the competing petitions are resolved through family court. The process typically takes—" "No." The word came from both twins simultaneously, their voices carrying such fierce determination that both adults turned to stare at them. "We won't go," Zara continued, her small chin raised in defiance that reminded Marcus painfully of David at that age. "We're not going back to people who hurt us, and we're not going to strangers who only want us because we're convenient. Children don't get to choose," Miss Knowles said gently, but with the firmness of someone who'd learned that kindness without boundaries helped no one. "Then adults need to make better choices," Zoe shot back. "We've been good kids. We've tried to fit in everywhere they put us. We've been polite and grateful and quiet, and none of it mattered because no one actually wanted us. They just wanted to feel good about helping sad orphans." Her words cut through the formal atmosphere like a blade, exposing the harsh reality. Beneath bureaucratic procedures, these children had been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect them, shuffled between homes like unwanted furniture until they'd stopped believing they deserved anything better. "But Uncle Marcus is different," Zara added, her voice softening as she looked at him with trust that was both precious and terrifying. "He knew our daddy. He has pictures and stories, and he made the house feel like somewhere we could belong. Instead of just somewhere we had to stay, Marcus felt the weight of their faith in him, like a physical force. These children were offering him their hearts, despite every lesson they'd learned about adults being temporary fixtures in their lives. They were choosing to hope again, and he would move mountains before he let that hope be disappointed. "I'll fight this," he told Ms. Knowles, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone accustomed to winning battles that mattered. "I'll hire the best family law attorneys in the state. I'll document every failure of care the girls experienced. I'll prove that blood family trumps bureaucratic convenience. Mr. Wellington, I understand your feelings, but the system exists to protect children's interests, not adult preferences. The courts will consider what's best for Zoe and Zara, not what's most convenient for their relatives. Then the courts will conclude that what's best for them is staying with someone who loves them, not returning to people who treated them as unpaid servants," Marcus replied firmly. Ms. Knowles gathered her papers with practiced efficiency, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional intensity that had replaced professional distance. "I'm required to remove the children today, Mr. Wellington. Emergency foster placement has already been arranged while the competing petitions are resolved." "How long?" Marcus asked, his heart breaking at the thought of the twins being uprooted again, just when they'd begun to feel safe. "The initial hearing is in 10 days. If you can demonstrate legal standing and file appropriate counter-petitions, by then the judge may consider your request for temporary custody pending full proceedings. 10 days. 10 days to prove that love mattered more than paperwork, that family meant more than bureaucratic efficiency, that 2 children who'd already lost too much deserved the one adult who wanted them not out of obligation or charity, but out of fierce, protective love." As Ms. Knowles prepared to escort his nieces away from the only place they'd felt truly safe, Marcus made a silent promise to his brother's memory and his own heart. He would bring them home. He would fight with every resource at his disposal, call in every favor, hire every expert necessary to prove that Zoe and Zara Wellington belonged exactly where they'd always belonged, with family who would never let them go. The battle for his nieces' futures was just beginning, but Marcus Wellington had never lost a fight that truly mattered. He wasn't about to start now. The emergency foster placement felt like a countdown to disaster. Marcus had exactly 10 days to build a legal case strong enough to overcome bureaucratic momentum and procedural precedents. In the business world, he'd conquered larger challenges in shorter timeframes, but those victories had been measured in dollars and market share. This battle would be won or lost on emotional terrain, where his usual weapons of logic and financial leverage carried less. Wait. His first call went to Jonathan Pierce, the most respected family law attorney in New York. Pierce's reputation was built on cases that seemed impossible, reuniting families separated by legal complexities, protecting children from systems that prioritized efficiency over individual needs, fighting bureaucracies that treated human lives like administrative problems to be solved. Marcus, Pierce said when they met in his corner office overlooking Central Park, I won't lie to you. The timing works against us. The Carters have institutional momentum. They initiated proceedings when the girls were classified as difficult placements. They have experience with the system, and judges tend to favor continuity over disruption, even when blood relatives surface late in the process. But Pierce's eyes held the gleam of someone who thrived on challenging cases. However, we have several powerful arguments. The girls' biological connection to you is undeniable. Their documented flight from the Carters suggests serious problems with that placement. Most importantly, we have something the other side lacks: genuine family connection and unlimited resources to provide for their future. The court petition Pierce prepared was a masterpiece of legal advocacy. 37 pages that told the story of two children who belonged with their father's family, supported by documentation that painted a vivid picture of their heritage, their current safety and happiness, and Marcus's commitment to their welfare. The petition formally requested emergency custody pending full proceedings, along with a restraining order preventing the girls' return to the Carters until allegations of emotional abuse could be fully investigated. But legal documents would only carry them so far. Pierce explained that family court judges were human beings who made decisions based on their assessment of what was truly best for the children involved. That meant building a compelling narrative about who Marcus was, who the twins were, and why their connection mattered more than bureaucratic convenience. We need character witnesses, Pierce explained as they strategized. People who can speak to your stability, your commitment to the girls, your ability to provide not just financial security, but genuine parental care. We need to show the court that you're not just a wealthy relative trying to acquire custody out of guilt or obligation. You're a man who's found his purpose through loving these children. Marcus thought immediately of Maria, whose maternal relationship with the twins had blossomed in the brief week they'd been in his home. She agreed to testify without hesitation, her weathered hands clasping his as she promised to tell the court about the transformation she'd witnessed, not just in the girls, who'd bloomed under genuine care, but in Marcus himself, who'd rediscovered his capacity for love through their presence. Those babies brought light back into your eyes, she said. Simply, anyone with sense can see you belong together. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the child psychologist Pierce recommended, agreed to evaluate the twins and provide expert testimony about their emotional state and needs. Her assessment, conducted during a 3-hour session at the temporary foster home, provided crucial professional support for their case. These children have experienced significant trauma through multiple placement failures, Dr. Chen explained in her report. However, they demonstrate remarkable resilience and attachment capacity. Their description of their time with Mr. Wellington shows clear signs of healthy bonding. They felt safe enough to express emotions they'd been suppressing, creative enough to engage in artistic activities that had been discouraged in previous placements, and secure enough to begin processing their grief over their mother's death. Perhaps most damaging to the Carters' case, Dr. Chen documented signs of emotional distress that correlated with the twins' time in that home. Both girls exhibited hypervigilance around authority figures, flinching responses to raised voices, and detailed recall of incidents that suggested systematic emotional intimidation rather than appropriate discipline. Marcus also reached out to his business associates, asking several prominent New York figures to provide character references. These weren't personal friends. He'd kept his social circles too small for that, but they were people who'd worked with him long enough to speak to his integrity, reliability, and capacity for long-term commitment. James Morrison, the board chair of Wellington Enterprises, wrote a letter describing Marcus as a man of unshakable principles who honors his commitments absolutely. Rebecca Torres, the head of the Children's Art Foundation, the same charity where Sarah had requested memorial donations, testified to Marcus's recent interest in children's programs and his substantial financial contribution following his discovery of the connection. But the most powerful witness came from an unexpected source. Father Michael O'Brien, the priest who'd officiated at David's funeral 20 years ago, had stayed in touch with the Wellington family over the years. He'd watched Marcus withdraw from community and connection after his brother's death, had seen the successful businessman become increasingly isolated despite his material prosperity. "I've known Marcus since he was a young man," Father O'Brien explained during his deposition. The tragedy of losing his brother nearly destroyed him, not just the death itself, but the weight of their unresolved conflict. He's carried that burden for 20 years, and I believe these children represent not just his brother's legacy, but his own path to healing. The man who took them in is not the same person who's lived in isolation for 2 decades. He's remembered who he was meant to be. The priest's words carried special weight because they acknowledged Marcus's flaws while testifying to his transformation. He wasn't presented as a perfect guardian, but as an imperfect man who'd found redemption through love, exactly the kind of authentic growth story that family court judges appreciated. Meanwhile, Pierce's investigation into the Carters revealed troubling patterns that undermined their petition for adoption. 3 previous foster children had been removed from their home after complaints about excessive discipline and emotional coldness. The complaints had been investigated, but not substantiated. Bureaucratic language that meant the children's voices hadn't been believed over adult denials. More damaging was the discovery that the Carters received substantial monthly payments for fostering older children, payments that would increase significantly if they formalized adoptions. Their motivation wasn't entirely altruistic. These children represented steady income, in addition to whatever emotional satisfaction came from helping troubled kids. The twins themselves, despite their youth, would be allowed to express their preferences to the judge during private chambers sessions. Pierce prepared them carefully for these conversations, explaining that they shouldn't feel responsible for the adult decisions being made, but that their voices mattered and would be heard. During one of their preparation sessions, Zoe showed remarkable insight into the situation. "The Carters want us because we're useful," she said, with the matter-of-fact wisdom of a child who'd learned to read adult motivations for survival. "We could cook and clean and watch their younger kids. Uncle Marcus doesn't need us to do anything except be ourselves." Zara nodded in agreement. "He likes it when we play piano, even when we make mistakes. He hangs our artwork on the refrigerator, like it matters. He listens to our stories about Mom without getting impatient or telling us to move on." Their observations were devastating in their simplicity. These children understood the difference between being valued for their utility and being treasured for their existence. They'd learned to recognize authentic love through its absence in previous placements. As the hearing date approached, Marcus found himself experiencing emotions he hadn't felt since his early business days, the combination of nervousness and determination that came with high-stakes situations where preparation met uncertainty. But this time, the stakes weren't measured in money or market position. They were measured in the lives of 2 children who'd already endured more loss than most adults experienced in a lifetime. The night before the hearing, Marcus sat in his study, reviewing the petition one final time. The document that would determine his niece's future was comprehensive and compelling, but he knew that courtroom proceedings could be unpredictable. Judges were human, subject to moods and biases and institutional pressures that might override even the strongest arguments. His phone rang, displaying the number of the emergency foster home where the twins were staying temporarily. The foster mother, Mrs. Rodriguez, had been kind enough to allow brief phone calls between Marcus and the girls during their separation. Uncle Marcus. Zoe's voice was small over the phone connection, carrying the uncertainty of a child who'd learned that good things could disappear without warning. "I'm here, sweetheart," he said, his throat tight with emotion. "Are you going to win tomorrow? Are we going to come home?" The question contained all the hope and fear these children had learned to carry. Marcus wanted to promise victory, to assure them that love and justice would prevail. But he'd learned that life rarely offered such guarantees. "I'm going to fight for you with everything I have," he said instead, choosing honesty over false comfort. "I'm going to tell the judge how much you mean to me and how much you belong in our family. But most importantly, I'm going to make sure your voices are heard, that everyone understands you're not problems to be solved, but precious people who deserve to be cherished. We know you'll try." Zara's voice joined the call, carrying the quiet strength that had gotten them through every previous disappointment. "Even if it doesn't work out, we'll always remember that someone wanted us just because we were us." As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that regardless of tomorrow's outcome, something profound had already been accomplished. These children had experienced unconditional love, had tasted what family was supposed to feel like, had learned that their worth wasn't determined by their utility to adults. Even if the system failed them again, they would carry that knowledge forward. But Marcus Wellington had not built an empire by accepting defeat before battles were fought. Tomorrow, he would walk into that courtroom armed with legal expertise, character witnesses, and documentation of his commitment to his niece's welfare. More importantly, he would carry the love that had transformed him from a lonely businessman into a man willing to fight for the family he'd thought was lost forever. The battle for Zoe and Zara's future would be won or lost in the next 24 hours. But Marcus was finally ready to prove that some things mattered more than systems and procedures, and family was worth any fight necessary to preserve it. The Manhattan family court building stood like a fortress of bureaucracy on Center Street, its imposing granite facade designed to inspire respect for the legal system, rather than comfort for the families whose lives would be decided within its walls. Marcus arrived an hour early, his navy suit pressed to perfection, his father's vintage watch steady on his wrist, marking time toward the most important appointment of his life. Pierce met him in the corridor outside courtroom 3B, carrying 3 briefcases filled with documentation that represented 10 days of intensive preparation. The lawyer's usually calm demeanor showed subtle signs of stress. This case had become personal for him too, as he'd witnessed Marcus's transformation from reluctant guardian to fierce advocate for his nieces. "Remember," Pierce said quietly, "Judge Morrison has a reputation for cutting through legal maneuvering to focus on what's genuinely best for children. She's seen enough custody battles to recognize authentic emotion versus performative concern. Be yourself, tell the truth, and trust that the strength of our case will speak for itself." The Carters arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, flanked by their own legal representation and radiating the confident composure of people accustomed to getting what they wanted from the system. Robert Carter was a thick-set man in his mid-50s, whose forced smile never reached his eyes. His wife, Patricia, carried herself with the rigid posture of someone who viewed children as projects requiring management rather than love. They nodded politely at Marcus, as if he were merely another obstacle to be navigated, rather than the biological uncle fighting for his family. Judge Morrison entered the courtroom with the measured dignity of someone who'd spent 3 decades making decisions that changed lives. She was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed capable of seeing through any pretense straight to underlying truth. Her reputation for fairness was matched by her intolerance for wasted time or emotional manipulation. This proceeding will determine temporary custody of minors Zoe Sarah Wellington and Zara Michelle Wellington, pending resolution of competing adoption petitions, she began, her voice carrying the authority of absolute jurisdiction over the children's futures. I want to be clear that my decision will be based solely on the best interests of these children, not the convenience of any adult parties involved. Pierce rose first, presenting Marcus's petition with the practiced eloquence that had built his reputation. Your Honor, we contend that biological family connection, combined with demonstrated commitment and unlimited resources to provide for these children's welfare, creates a compelling case for custody to remain with their paternal Uncle Marcus Wellington. He methodically presented their evidence, beginning with the DNA test results that definitively established Marcus as the twins' uncle. The scientific documentation was irrefutable, connecting the children to a family they'd never known existed. While they'd been shuffled between temporary placements, these results prove beyond any doubt that Zoe and Zara are the daughters of David Wellington, Mr. Marcus Wellington's deceased brother, Pierce explained, handing copies to the judge and opposing counsel. They are not simply foster children in need of placement. They are family members who belong with their blood relatives. Dr. Chen's psychological evaluation came next, her professional assessment providing expert validation for what everyone who'd observed the twins with Marcus could see with their own eyes. The children had thrived during their brief time in his home, exhibiting signs of healthy attachment and emotional security that had been absent in previous placements. Dr. Chen's report documents remarkable improvement in both children's emotional state during the week they spent with Mr. Wellington, Pierce continued. They showed increased creativity, improved sleep patterns, and willingness to process their grief over their mother's death, all indicators of children who felt safe enough to begin genuine healing. Maria's testimony brought tears to several observers' eyes as she described the transformation she'd witnessed in both Marcus and the twins. Her weathered hands gestured expressively as she spoke in accented English about children who'd brought laughter back to a house that had known only silence for 20 years. Mr. Marcus, he was like a man living in winter for so long he forgot about spring, she said simply. These girls, they brought the light back to his eyes, and for them, they finally found someone who saw them as blessings instead of burdens. Father O'Brien's testimony carried different weight, addressing Marcus's character and capacity for long-term commitment. The priest spoke of a man who'd carried guilt and isolation for 20 years, who'd found redemption through the opportunity to love his brother's children. I've watched Marcus struggle with the weight of regret since David's death, Father O'Brien explained. These children represent more than just family connection. They're his opportunity to honor his brother's memory by becoming the man David believed he could be. The most powerful moment came when Judge Morrison called for private chambers to speak with the twins themselves. Zoe and Zara entered the courtroom holding hands, their identical faces serious but determined. They wore the simple dresses Maria had bought them, their hair neatly braided, looking every inch the well-cared-for children they'd become during their brief time with Marcus. In chambers, away from the adults whose decisions would determine their fate, the girls spoke with remarkable clarity about their experiences and preferences. Judge Morrison later revealed that their testimonies had been both heartbreaking and illuminating. Two children who understood the difference between being wanted and being needed, who could articulate why they felt safe with their uncle in ways they hadn't felt safe anywhere else. When they returned to the courtroom, Zoe raised her hand politely. Your Honor, may we say something to everyone? Judge Morrison nodded, and Zoe stood with the poise of someone much older than her 9 years. "We know adults think kids don't understand grown-up things," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "But we understand more than you think. We know the difference between people who want us because we're useful and people who want us because we're family." Zara joined her sister, their unity unshakable even in the formal intimidation of legal proceedings. "Uncle Marcus doesn't need us to clean his house or watch other kids or be grateful all the time. He likes us just for being us. He hangs our pictures on his refrigerator and listens to our stories and lets us play piano even when we make mistakes." The simple honesty of their words seemed to shift something in the courtroom's atmosphere. Here were 2 children who'd been failed by multiple systems, speaking with wisdom earned through experiences no child should have to navigate, asking for nothing more than the right to stay with someone who genuinely loved them. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he watched his nieces advocate for themselves with courage that humbled him. They'd learned to be their own strongest voices because too often no adult had been willing to speak for them. But today, in this courtroom, their voices joined with evidence and testimony and legal arguments to create a case that transcended bureaucratic procedure. As Judge Morrison called for a brief recess before hearing the Carters' response, Marcus caught sight of his niece's hopeful faces and made a silent promise. Whatever the outcome of these proceedings, he would spend the rest of his life proving worthy of the faith these children had placed in him. They'd taught him what David had been trying to show him 20 years ago, that love was always worth fighting for, and family was precious precisely because it couldn't be purchased or manufactured through paperwork. The battle for his niece's future had reached its crucial moment, but Marcus had never felt more certain that he was fighting for exactly the right cause. The Carters' legal team presented their case with the mechanical precision of people who'd navigated the foster care system successfully many times before. Their attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Ms. Hamilton, painted a picture of experienced caregivers who dedicated their lives to providing stability for difficult children whom other families couldn't or wouldn't handle. "My clients have fostered 17 children over the past 12 years. Hamilton argued, gesturing toward the Carters with practiced theatricality. "They have the systems, experience, and proven track record necessary to provide structure for children who've experienced multiple placement failures. Mr. Wellington, while well-intentioned, is a single man with no childcare experience, attempting to take on twins who require specialized understanding of trauma-related behavioral challenges." Robert Carter took the stand first, his testimony carefully coached to present himself as a selfless advocate for vulnerable children. He spoke of early morning school preparations, late-night comfort sessions during nightmares, and the patience required to help damaged children learn to trust adults again. "We've made our home a healing place for kids who've been failed by the system," he said, his voice carrying practiced sincerity. "Zoe and Zara were making real progress with us. They'd learned our household routines, were contributing to family responsibilities, and were beginning to understand that love comes with expectations and boundaries." But under Pierce's cross-examination, Carter's composure began to crack. Pierce had done his homework, uncovering details about the Carters, methods that painted a different picture than their carefully crafted testimonies suggested. "Mr. Carter, isn't it true that Zara was punished for crying about missing her mother by being denied dinner and sent to bed early?" Pierce asked, consulting notes from Dr. Chen's psychological evaluation. "We don't reward disruptive behavior," Carter replied stiffly. "Children need to learn that grief can't be used as an excuse for affecting household harmony." The answer revealed everything Judge Morrison needed to understand about the Carters' approach to childcare. They viewed normal expressions of grief and trauma as behavioral problems requiring correction rather than emotional needs requiring compassion. Pierce continued systematically dismantling their credibility, revealing a pattern of children being removed from their care after complaints about excessive discipline and emotional coldness. The Carters hadn't hurt the children physically, but they'd consistently failed to provide the nurturing environment that traumatized kids needed to heal. Patricia Carter's testimony was even more damaging. Her rigid demeanor and clinical language betrayed a fundamental misunderstanding of what children required from their caregivers. When Pierce asked about her attachment to Zoe and Zara specifically, her responses focused on their usefulness rather than their individual personalities. "They were very helpful with our younger foster children," she said approvingly. "Good at following instructions and completing assigned tasks without complaint. With more time, they would have integrated fully into our family structure." The courtroom fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. These children weren't beloved daughters in the Carters' vision. They were useful household members who could be trained to comply with expectations rather than celebrated for their unique gifts and perspectives. Judge Morrison's questions during cross-examination revealed her growing skepticism about the Carters' petition. "Mrs. Carter, can you tell me about Zoe and Zara's individual interests, their artistic talents, their musical abilities?" Patricia Carter's blank expression made it clear she'd never bothered to learn about the twins' creative gifts, the very qualities that had made Marcus fall in love with them within days of their arrival. In nearly 6 months of care, she'd seen them only as resources rather than remarkable individuals with talents worth nurturing. When both sides had presented their cases, Judge Morrison called for a 30-minute recess while she reviewed the evidence and prepared her decision. The waiting felt endless, each minute stretching into eternity as Marcus sat with his legal team, unable to read the judge's expression for any hint of her intentions. Pierce remained cautiously optimistic. The children's testimony was powerful, and the Carters' cross-examination revealed exactly the kind of institutional thinking that fails kids, he whispered. But family court can be unpredictable. Judges sometimes prioritize system stability over individual circumstances. When court reconvened, Judge Morrison's expression was grave as she prepared to deliver her decision. The custody order she held would determine whether Zoe and Zara returned to people who saw them as projects or stayed with the uncle who'd learned to see them as miracles. "I want to address the children first," Judge Morrison began, looking directly at the twins who sat between Marcus and the Carters like the physical representation of the choice she had to make. "Zoe and Zara, I want you to know that everything I have heard today tells me you are remarkable young ladies who deserve adults who treasure you for exactly who you are." She paused, consulting her notes one final time before continuing. "The law requires me to consider what is in your best interests, not what is most convenient for the adults involved. Based on all testimony and evidence presented, it is clear that your emotional, psychological, and developmental needs are best served by remaining with your biological family." Marcus felt his heart stop as the judge's words began to register. She was ruling in their favor, but he didn't dare believe it until he heard the complete decision. "Mr. Wellington, this court grants your petition for emergency custody pending full adoption proceedings. The children will be returned to your care immediately, with regular monitoring by Child Protective Services to ensure their continued well-being." The custody order Judge Morrison signed was more than a legal document. It was a declaration that family mattered, that love trumped bureaucracy, that 2 children who'd been failed by the system deserved the chance to flourish with someone who wanted them not for their utility, but for their irreplaceable selves. Zoe and Zara launched themselves into Marcus's arms with cries of joy that echoed through the courtroom, their relief and happiness so profound that several observers wiped away tears. The twins clung to their uncle as if afraid he might disappear, their small bodies shaking with the release of weeks of suppressed anxiety. "We're going home," Zara whispered against Marcus's shoulder, the words carrying all the weight of children. who'd searched their entire lives for a place where they truly belonged. "Yes," Marcus whispered back, his voice thick with emotion as he held his brother's daughters close. "We're going home, and you're never leaving again." As they walked out of the courthouse together, Marcus carrying the custody order that made their family official, he thought about David and Sarah and the love story that had created these extraordinary children. His brother had been right about everything that mattered. Family was worth any sacrifice. Love conquered fear, and some dreams were precious enough to fight for. Until the very end, the Wellington family had been restored, not through blood alone, but through the choice to love unconditionally. Marcus finally understood what David had been trying to teach him 20 years ago. The most important victories were measured not in money or power, but in the hearts that chose to stay together against all odds. 6 months after the custody hearing, the Wellington mansion had been transformed from a mausoleum of memories into a living, breathing home, filled with the beautiful chaos that only children can create. The grand hallways echoed with piano practice and laughter. The pristine kitchen bore the cheerful evidence of art projects and baking experiments, and the formal dining room had been converted into a homework station where identical heads bent over math problems and science reports. Marcus stood in his study doorway, watching Zoe and Zara work at the antique table that had once hosted board meetings and serious financial discussions. Now it was covered with colored pencils, textbooks, and the comfortable clutter of children who felt secure enough to spread their belongings freely. The twins had grown in the months since the hearing, not just physically, though they'd both shot up several inches, but emotionally, blossoming into the confident, creative individuals they'd always been, underneath their protective layers of survival-learned caution. Zoe looked up from her geography homework, catching sight of her uncle, watching them with the gentle expression that had replaced his old businessman's mask of stern efficiency. "Uncle Marcus, can you help me with the map of South America? I keep mixing up Peru and Bolivia." The easy familiarity of her request filled Marcus with warmth that never seemed to diminish. He'd become Uncle Marcus naturally, the title evolving, from formal politeness to genuine affection without conscious decision. These children had taught him that family wasn't about blood alone. It was about showing up consistently, loving without conditions, and creating the kind of safety that allowed people to be their truest selves. "Of course," he said, settling into the chair beside her that had become his designated homework helping spot. "But first, look what Maria brought us." He held up a large manila envelope that had arrived that morning, containing the professional photographs they'd commissioned the previous week. The photographer had captured them in the mansion's garden, surrounded by the spring flowers that had bloomed just as their family had, gradually, naturally, beautifully. The new family portrait showed 3 people who belonged together so obviously that it was hard to imagine they'd ever been apart. Marcus stood behind his niece's chairs, his hands resting protectively on their shoulders, his face showing a contentment that 20 years of isolation had never produced. The twins leaned slightly toward each other in the unconscious unity that defined their relationship, but both were also clearly connected to their uncle, their relaxed postures speaking to security that had become second nature. "We look like a real family," Zara observed, studying the photograph with the artist's eye she'd inherited from both parents. "Like we've always been together." "We have always been together," Marcus replied, meaning it completely. "We just didn't know it yet. Sometimes the best things in life are waiting for us to be ready to recognize them." The twins had thrived in ways that continued to amaze everyone who knew them. Zoe had joined the school choir and discovered a talent for leadership, organizing a fundraiser for children in foster care that raised more money than the high school's annual efforts. Zara had won a citywide art competition with a painting of their family that now hung in the mansion's main hall, the first artwork to grace those walls that wasn't a historical portrait or expensive acquisition. Both girls had resumed piano lessons with renewed enthusiasm, their natural musical abilities nurtured by a teacher who understood that creativity flourished best in environments of encouragement rather than criticism. They performed duets at school concerts now, their synchronized movements at the keyboard reflecting the deeper harmony of two souls who'd learned to trust that their stage wouldn't disappear beneath their feet. Dr. Chen had documented their progress. In follow-up evaluations required by the court, her reports consistently noting their remarkable resilience and continued emotional growth. The nightmares that had plagued them in previous placements had virtually disappeared. Their grades had improved from adequate to excellent. Most importantly, they'd learned to plan for the future rather than simply surviving day by day. Marcus had changed just as dramatically. His business associates noticed the difference immediately. Meetings that used to consume entire days now ended when school pickup time approached. Charity board positions that had been purely nominal obligations became genuine commitments to causes that affected children and families. He'd even begun dating Rebecca Torres from the Children's Art Foundation, a relationship that had developed slowly from professional collaboration into personal connection. "The girls changed everything for you," Rebecca had observed during dinner. "The previous week, you went from being a successful businessman to being a complete human being." She was right, of course. Zoe and Zara had taught him that success without love was just expensive loneliness, that the walls he'd built for protection had become prisons that locked out everything worth having. They'd shown him that being needed wasn't a burden, but a privilege, that vulnerability could be a strength when shared with people who would never use it against you. The adoption process had been completed 3 months earlier, making their family legally permanent in ways that went far beyond the emergency custody order. The twins were officially Wellingtons now, their new birth certificates reflecting Marcus as their adoptive father and legal guardian. But the paperwork had been just a formality. They'd been a real family from the moment he'd opened his door. To 2 frightened children seeking shelter from a storm, Maria still worked for them, but her role had evolved from housekeeper to surrogate grandmother, spoiling the girls with Dominican cooking lessons and teaching them Spanish phrases that made Marcus laugh when they used them to negotiate later bedtimes. She'd been with the Wellington family for 30 years now, witnessing its near extinction and miraculous rebirth. Mr. David would be so proud, she'd told Marcus just that morning, watching the twins practice piano in the music room that had sat silent for 2 decades. He always said family was the only thing that really mattered. These babies, they brought his spirit back to this house. As evening settled over Manhattan, Marcus found himself in the music room, listening to Zoe and Zara play the piece they'd been working on for weeks, Pachelbel's Canon in D, arranged for 4 hands. The complex harmonies required perfect timing and trust, each twin dependent on the other to create something beautiful that neither could achieve alone. He thought about the photograph hidden in their backpack that first stormy night, the one that had connected them to a family they'd never met. Sarah had prepared her daughters well, teaching them about the uncle who lived behind walls but whose heart could be reached by children brave enough to knock on his door during a storm. The twins finished their piece and turned to him with identical smiles, their faces glowing with the pride that came from mastering something difficult through persistence and cooperation. In their expressions, Marcus could see echoes of David's determination and Sarah's gentle wisdom, genetic gifts that would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. "That was beautiful," he said, meaning it completely. "Your parents would be so proud of the young ladies you're becoming." As they prepared for bed, following routines that had become comfortable traditions over the past 6 months, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. The mansion that had once felt like a tomb now buzzed with the energy of children who were loved unconditionally. The future that had once stretched ahead like an endless series of empty days now held promise of school plays and graduation ceremonies and grandchildren who would carry the Wellington name into another generation. Sometimes the greatest gifts did come disguised as strangers at the door. Sometimes the family you'd been searching for found you when you least expected it but most needed it. And sometimes the love you thought you'd lost forever returned in forms more precious than you'd ever dared imagine. The Wellington family was complete once again, bound together not by obligation or convenience, but by the kind of love that chose to stay when staying was difficult and to hope when hope seemed impossible. In the end, that was the only legacy that truly mattered, not the buildings or the money or the business empire, but the hearts that had learned to love without reservation and the family that had chosen to stay together against all odds. Marcus turned off the lights in the music room, leaving the piano bench ready for tomorrow's practice session, and headed upstairs to check on his daughters one last time before bed. Outside, New York continued its restless dance. But inside the Wellington mansion, 3 people who'd found each other against impossible odds slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged.